Welcome to another sew along. Today we are going to be making Lilah. Lilah is a very sweet dress with some unique features. It has a puff sleeve, but it's not just a regular puff sleeve. It has a keyhole, and that is bound with a piece of bias, and then there are ties for each sleeve, and then there are sashes that are actually ties. There'll be 3 sewn into each side seam and tied in the back. There is some fullness in the bodice at the front, at both the bottom and the top, and the skirt is full, and our little girls love to twirl. This is a size 6 month to 8, and I am going to line mine. The pattern only calls for the bodice to be lined, so as I get to the changes that will be a little bit different, I'll point those out so that if you want to line yours, or if you want to line them at some point, you can. There are lots of pattern pieces for the Lilah pattern and lots of things to mark. The front bodice has X's at the top where you stop and start your gathering threads for the fullness at the neckline, as well as X's for the fullness at the waistline. And then there are the marks for the sash placements at the side seam. And you will just cut 1, and then you will also cut 2 backs and mark the center front, or excuse me, mark the center back as well as the fold line. You don't have to mark it all the way down, just mark it up by the neckline. And then I usually go back later and mark my buttonholes, but that's completely up to you. And then the bodice is lined, and they are different pieces. So there is a back lining piece that really doesn't have any special marks, but you're going to cut 2 of those, and then you will cut 1 bodice front lining. The sleeve, like I said, is really unique, and there are also several things to mark on it. There's the X's where you gather the sleeve at the top. There's the X's where you gather the sleeve at each side of the keyhole, and then of course the front and back, and then the dot for the shoulder seam. Also, you will have a small piece that is for your bias for the keyhole. So it is cut on the bias. And then you will have a placket piece for your skirt, and you will mark on the skirt. The only thing you really mark is where the placket will be on one of your skirt panels for the back. And then we have 2 long pattern pieces, and these are for the ties at the sleeve as well as the ties at the waistline. And they are both 1 inch wide. They are not cut on the bias, even though we tend to refer to them as bias because we're going to use a bias tape maker. But they are not. They're cut on the grain line. And what I do, since they are both 1 inch wide, I just use my ruler, my rotary, and a mat, and go ahead and cut the number of strips I need of 1 inch wide strips. And then I refer to my pattern pieces to shorten them to the length they need to be. So you might want to try that. I just find that I have a neater strip if I use my rotary cutter and don't try to place these pattern pieces on there. If you happen to have a bias tape maker, and it's the 1/2 inch, which is what we would need, get that too. If you don't, we have a really neat way of doing the bias, so that you still don't burn your fingers trying to fold and refold. And they've just been really hard to get right now. I think a lot of people are using them for ties for masks. So we will eventually have them back in the shop, but until then, I'll show you a way that's really kind of cool. So gather everything and we will get started. Okay. We're ready to get started. We are just going to pretty much follow along with the original instructions. And for the bodice, I have gone ahead and put in my gathering threads from the first X to the last X at the bottom, and the first X to the last X at the neckline. And then what I did was I went ahead and tied a knot in on one end of my gathering threads. I tied a knot, and then that still leaves the back threads loose, and it still leaves the threads loose on the other side. And the reason for that is you're going to use your front lining as your template. And so I can just have more control of my gathers if I already have a knot at one end and then work from the other end for pulling the threads. So I'm going to go ahead and pin my bottom of my bodice so that it matches the lining. And then I'll do the same thing here at the top. And I'll just match the point of the shoulder seam right there. Now, what I'm going to do is, since my knot that I tied is on this end, I'm going to start pulling from this end. And I like to go ahead and get my bodice to the size I need, and then I'll work on distributing the gathers real evenly. So once we've got that to the right size, looks like a pretty good fit, then I'll just go ahead and tie the threads on this other end. And then I can work my gathers so that they're distributed evenly. If I still need to pull a little bit, I can. Even the end that's knotted, you can still pull it. So I'm going to work on that a little bit. And then at the top, we do the same thing. And again, I've tied the two top threads on this side. So I'm going to start by just working this other side. Sometimes I like to pull it a little too tight and then loosen it back out. But it is important that your bodice lining and your bodice match. So once I've got that where I feel like it matches well, of course you can even put some pins over here if that helps to keep your lining and your bodice together. And I think I'm ready to tie these. So I'll work on that a little bit. And the next thing we're going to do is the shoulder seams of the bodice and the shoulder seams of the lining. And then I have gone ahead and made some piping. You may want to just use purchased piping. I believe, let me see, I think the pattern said for piping you need about 1.5 yards. And of course that'd be for the biggest size. And I'm making a size 4, but it doesn't hurt to have a little bit too much piping. Okay, get that done, and we'll be back to do shoulder seams and to work on putting the piping around the neckline. See you back in a bit. Now we're ready to put our piping on the neckline. But first, it's best to go back and check one more time and be sure that you have your gathers pulled up so that your neckline of your bodice fits the neckline of the bodice lining. So that looks pretty good. And for the piping, we are going to start at the fold line in the back. And this is the center back line, so don't start it there. This is the fold line is closer to the cut edge. So I'm going to start it just a little past that fold line. And then I will ease it on and ease it off when I get to the other side. And then the next thing we will do is we will sew the lining to the bodice in the back. So that means you're going to put these two back edges together, and this is just one straight stitch, just straight down the back. And don't worry that this doesn't match. It's not supposed to match right now. So let's get busy with that, and then we will move on to the neckline, and then we would be ready to do these long strips. So I've got my piping on my neckline, and at each end of the piping I'm pulling out about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of cord, and then just pulling it back so that right there isn't any actual cord, and that will make that a less bulky seam there at the neckline. And then you know, if you've watched very many of our sew-alongs, you know that we often use a baby interfacing on bodices and yokes that are lawn weight. And I didn't this time. I did not want these gathers to be anything but just very soft. And so I chose not to put interfacing on the bodice, but I did go ahead and fuse a 1-inch strip of interfacing on each back edge where the buttons and buttonholes will go, just to add a little more stability there. So once I got this seam done, then I was able to match my shoulder seams and match my side edges and my arm curve, and then give that a good press right there. And I've already done that on the other side. So now I'm going to flip the lining so that it's right sides to right sides, and again matching those shoulder seams. So this will actually fold back this way. You don't need to press that, because after we stitch this neckline, it will be going back the way it will stay. So for this seam, if you took your piping foot off, go ahead and put it back on and stitch with this side up so that you can see your stitching line and you can feel that cording in there, and stitch right along the neckline. So you'll be going all the way around, matching the shoulder seam this side. And I'll put a few more pins in that, and I will sew the neckline down, trim it, clip it so that everything lays really nice and flat, and then turn it and press it. And then we'll be ready to move on to those long strips, those long ties and sashes. So get that, and we will be right back. Okay, we are ready to go to step 9. And one of the first things I want you to do is lightly starch all of your strips. And that will cause your bias to crease more easily, and it'll be easier to work with. And for a bias tape maker like this, I'm not going to fold the ends in yet like it says to in step 9. It makes it harder to get it in here, but after we have pressed it, then you can unfold it, fold that end in, and then refold it and press it a little bit there on the end again. But to get started on a bias tape maker like this, I went ahead and pressed, maybe about 1.5 inches or so, where I just took the two cut edges here and pressed them to the middle. So there's approximately 1/4 of an inch there, and they're just barely meeting. So that still gives you a 1/2 inch. So to get this started, you just kind of stick it in there. And if you have trouble, like I'm having, of course I'm taking something so easy, making it look so hard. There. Okay. And then to get it all the way out to the end, you'll need some kind of awl or something that you can just stick in there until you see the end popping out like that. Then once you've got that going on, then you can just pull your bias. It's not bias, it's straight. We're using a bias tape maker. And I'm going to take a pin and just pin that down there. That way it kind of stays taut as I press it. And so what you want to look for is as the tape or as the fabric is going through this end, you want it to stay centered. You don't want it to be all to one side because it'll start climbing up the edges here. So you want to watch that. And then, so as you pull, you can kind of see how that's the way it should look once you get past where I had already pressed it. So it should kind of stay out flat and just gently curve up on each side. So the best way to do that is just move the iron as I move the bias tape maker. And then having that pin hold this long strip down really helps, kind of like having a third hand. But you can kind of see how that works. And then once you've gone the full strip, this one is for one of the sashes, one of the ties. So you only need to press under one end, about 1/4 of an inch, and then refold. Press that so that end will stay in there. And then you're going to fold it again so that you end up with a 1/4 inch tie. And then we're going to top stitch that so that you can stitch those two folded edges together, and you're going to stitch really close to those folds, about a 1/16 of an inch. So if you look on your tape measure and see what a 1/16 of an inch looks like, you know that you're just barely going to be on those folds. So then you'll go back through like this, pressing it all, and then you'll be ready to stitch it. But if you don't have a bias tape maker, then you can make your own. So what we're going to do, you will need some cardstock. If you don't have cardstock, maybe an index card. It needs to be heavier than just copy paper. And this size doesn't matter. This is probably, let's see, it's about 3 inches by 2-ish, and it's not even really cut straight. So, because we want a strip that folds in to form a 1/2 inch, I drew 2 lines. They're just kind of randomly placed, although they are side by side, and these are a 1/2 inch. And then you need something to cut those open. An X-Acto knife will work. This looks kind of wicked, but this works really well. It's nice and sharp, and you just want to cut right on that line. And I'm pressing pretty hard on this mat, And then after you have cut both of those lines, go back and cut right beside them so that you make a little notch. Because what we're going to do is I'm going to back over that, and now I'm going to cut across the ends so that I can take out that little piece of cardstock. Let's see if I can get it out. See how that just comes out there, and now you've got a little slit that's bigger than it would be if you only cut it once. So I've got two little slits there now. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same tie, and I'll just start at the other end. Oh, and I forgot to say, when you're doing this, whether it's with this or an actual Bodice tape maker, you need to start with the wrong side of the fabric up. So I'm going to move this out of the way and this out of the way. So again, I'm going to, before I start it, make sure that is the wrong side. Yep. I'm going to press 1/4 of an inch toward the center on one edge, and then 1/4 of an inch on the other edge. And you just need to do that for a couple of inches. Now, what you want to do is get that end. So this is the top. And so you want to poke that in there. And then poke it back out so it comes back to the top again. Let's see if I can use this and poke it in there a little easier. Okay, so just like with the other Bodice tape maker, I'm going to pin to hold the strip in place down here. And then you can see, this is really pretty cool, as it goes in those slits, it automatically folds. And so what you do is you keep your iron right there, and then you just pull this cardboard or this cardstock, keeping your iron not necessarily on the cardstock, but right at the edge of it. And you just have to be sure that this continues to fold as equally as you can keep it. So I'm going to kind of redo that a little bit. It's getting off a little. But this is a lot better than burning your fingers. There. Oh, it's time to unpin. So, this may take a little bit of practice, and I did not make this up on my own. I spent a lot of time with YouTube and Googling things, and there were all kinds of ideas, all similar to this. Some of them just went into way too much effort, when all you really needed was just a little square piece of cardstock and a couple of slits. So once you're done with those, again, like I was saying, for the ties, you open them up on one end, refold that 1/4 inch, fold it back, and then you will press it in half so that you have 1/4 of an inch. So work on that, and then I will show you how to stitch these. A little something different you do with your needle position so that this will feed through under your presser foot easier. See you back in a little bit. Okay, what I wanted to show you about stitching these ties is that you know how you have 2 feed dogs. Well, usually when you're stitching, you have at least your fabric on one of the feed dogs, and really it would be hard to get this tie to be on top of a feed dog without moving your needle position. So that's what I did. So I moved the tie over so that it's on the left hand feed dog, left hand side. I lowered my presser foot, and then I moved my needle position, and this is going to vary from machine to machine. And then once you have it so that it's going to hit the fabric right along that 1/16 of an inch edge, and remember these are the 2 folded edges here that we're stitching together now, and I'm starting with the end of the tie that is unfinished, doesn't have a folded end. It's going to go in a seam, so I'm actually starting just a little bit beyond the end, and I'm not worrying about back stitching because it'll be in the seam. So once you've done that, then you can see where you're going. You can see that your machine is stitching right along that edge where those 2 folded edges are, and you can see that it feeds really nicely. So try that, and I think that will help this part go more smoothly. So after I get this one done, I will pin it in on this side seam. So I've got the 2 pinned. I had a mark right here where you put the first one, and then I'll put the one that I finished right up next to the second one. And then after that, you will do your side seams each separately, lining to lining and fabric to fabric. Go ahead and stitch those ties in place just so they don't move, and then stitch your side seam and stitch your side seam of your lining. Like this, and then this is what it will look like. You'll have your 2 side seams stitched, and your ties are going to be sandwiched in there, and so they will lay like this, and they will actually lay toward the back, and then go ahead and base the lining to the fabric at the armhole so that that fabric doesn't shift. And that's all we'll do for today. Tomorrow we'll pick up with piping the bottom of the bodice and the sleeves and finishing the dress. See you tomorrow.